In the summer of 1989, a crime like that happened in northeast Kansas City, Missouri. A 16-year-old girl named Fawn Marie Cox was murdered in her own bedroom while her mother and siblings slept one floor below her. And for 31 years, the person who did it walked free, lived his life, breathed the same air as the family that buried her. This is the story of how he was finally found, not through a confession, not through a witness, not through any of the traditional tools detectives had spent decades using. He was found through a strand of DNA, a public genealogy database, and a science that didn't exist when Fawn Cox set her alarm clock for the last time. Before we get into this, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. Stories like this one deserve to be heard. You have to understand what Kansas City looked like in the summer of 1989 to understand why this crime hit the way it did. This wasn't a city where people expected the worst. Kansas City was, and still is, a city with deep roots, jazz bars, legendary barbecue joints, and working-class neighborhoods where families stayed for generations. The northeast side of the city was exactly that kind of place. Tight streets, familiar faces, front yards that connected at the edges where children played. The kind of neighborhood where a parent could look out the front window and know the name of every kid on the block. Fawn Cox grew up in that world. She lived with her family near East 9th Street and Van Brunt Boulevard, and by 16, she was already showing the kind of character that made people pay attention. She had gotten herself a summer job at Worlds of Fun, Kansas City's sprawling amusement park. While other teenagers were sleeping until noon, Fawn was pulling shifts in the July heat, earning her own money, taking responsibility for herself in a way that was unusual for her age. On July 26, 1989, Fawn worked a full shift that stretched into the evening. Her day ended at 11 o'clock at night. She came straight home, no detours, no stops, no hanging around outside, because she had another shift the next morning and she took that seriously. The house was quiet when she got back. Her mother and her siblings were already asleep. The Missouri summer heat had settled into the house and the air conditioner was running, that constant low mechanical hum that becomes invisible when you live with it, a sound that fills the rooms and smooths out all the smaller sounds underneath it. Fawn walked upstairs to her second-floor bedroom. She changed into her pajamas. And before she got into bed, she did something completely ordinary. She set her alarm clock, because she didn't want to be late. That was the last thing she ever did. The alarm went off the next morning at the time Fawn had set it. Nobody turned it off. No footsteps came down the stairs. No voice called out. No sounds of the morning routine filtering through the house. Just the alarm, ringing in an empty silence that her family downstairs slowly began to register as wrong. Her mother and her sister Felicia went upstairs. What Felicia found in that bedroom is the kind of memory that never leaves a person. She went to shake Fawn awake. She said her sister had been gone for a long time already. Fawn Cox had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled to death while her family slept in the rooms below. The Kansas City Police Department arrived and began working through the crime scene. And from the very beginning, the investigators found a detail that told them something critical about who they were looking for. The killer hadn't broken into the house through the front door. He hadn't come through a ground-floor window. He had climbed up to the second floor and entered specifically through the window of Fawn's bedroom. That single detail, that specific choice of entry, told detectives that the person who did this didn't come to a random house on a random night. Climbing to a second-floor window in the dead of night, without making enough sound to wake anyone sleeping below, was not the behavior of someone who didn't know what they were walking into. This was someone who knew which room was hers. Someone who knew which window led to it. Someone who understood the layout of that house well enough to move through it like it was familiar territory. CSI collected biological evidence from Fawn's body and properly preserved it. At the time, no one knew how important that decision would turn out to be. The investigation that followed moved quickly to 3 teenagers from the northeast Kansas City neighborhood. Witnesses had connected them to the crime. Circumstantial evidence gave law enforcement enough grounds to file charges. All 3 were charged. Because they were juveniles, their names were sealed by Missouri law. The media didn't publish them. The community filled in the gaps with rumors. During interrogations, the accused pointed toward the 9th Street Dog Gang, a local group that had earned a troublemaking reputation in the neighborhood. One of the 3 teenagers was held in custody for 8 months. 8 months of a person's life. 8 months while the actual killer continued living freely in the same community. The 1989 DNA technology couldn't do what investigators needed it to do. It could compare blood types. It could conduct basic DNA analysis. What it returned was inconclusive, not enough to convict, but not the kind of clean exoneration that ends a case either. The case was suspended between two possibilities without a way to move in either direction. Then the main witness, the person whose testimony had built the foundation under the entire case, recanted, admitted to lying, and without that statement, without conclusive DNA, without physical evidence that directly tied any of the three to Fawn's death, the charges were dropped. All three were released. The real killer wasn't one of them. He had never been charged. He had never even been seriously investigated. And now, with the case officially without suspects, he continued living as he always had. Cases like this one have two possible fates. They either get filed away, quietly boxed up and shelved in the back of an evidence room until someone's retirement clears out the last person who remembered the victim's name, or they stay alive, carried forward by the people who couldn't let them go. The Fawn Cox case was the second kind. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, successive generations of detectives at the Kansas City Police Department kept the case on their desks. They met periodically with the Cox family. They reviewed the files. They pursued new leads when new leads emerged. Captain Ben Caldwell later described why the case held that kind of weight. This was an innocent child killed in her own bed. That doesn't leave you, not if you're the kind of detective who got into the work for the right reasons. The biological evidence sat in KCPD storage, properly preserved, patiently waiting for technology that didn't exist yet. In the early years of the 21st century, the KCPD crime lab ran the biological samples through updated DNA testing. The technology had advanced enough to do something that 1989's methods couldn't accomplish: build a complete genetic profile of the killer from the preserved evidence. That profile was uploaded to CODIS, the FBI's National Criminal DNA Database, a repository containing the genetic profiles of people who had been arrested and tested inside the American justice system. No match came back. Fawn's killer had never entered the criminal justice system in a way that put his DNA into the national database. CODIS couldn't find someone it had never cataloged. The case hit another wall. But the wall was not the end. In 2018, a case in California changed the way law enforcement agencies across the country thought about unsolved homicides. The Golden State Killer, a serial murderer and rapist whose crimes had spanned decades and terrorized multiple California communities, was identified through a technique called advanced genetic genealogy. Investigators had taken his DNA from crime scene evidence and uploaded it to a public genealogy database, the kind where millions of ordinary Americans had voluntarily uploaded their own genetic information to trace their ancestry and find distant relatives. By identifying distant cousins of the killer, people who hadn't committed any crime and had no idea their DNA would help solve one, investigators were able to build a family tree that eventually pointed to a single name. The Golden State Killer was arrested, charged, convicted, and the technique that had identified him was suddenly the most talked about development in cold case investigation in a generation. Captain Caldwell knew immediately what it meant for the Fawn Cox case. The problem wasn't the technology, the problem was access. Advanced genetic genealogy was expensive. It required specialized expertise that most police departments, even major city departments, didn't have in-house. KCPD needed a partner who could bring both the resources and the capability to the table. In 2020, that partnership came together. The Kansas City Police Department and the FBI's Kansas City Field Office joined forces to apply advanced genetic genealogy to the biological evidence that had been sitting in KCPD storage since the summer of 1989. The process worked like this. The killer's genetic profile, built from the preserved crime scene evidence, was uploaded to a public genealogy database. Not CODIS, not a criminal database, but a platform where civilians had voluntarily shared their DNA. The system searched for partial genetic matches, the kind that indicate a shared ancestor somewhere on a family tree. Those partial matches were used to map out family branches. Then forensic genealogists worked through those branches, crossing off the dead, eliminating those who were too young or too old in 1989, narrowing the living possibilities until a single name emerged at the end of the path. 31 years after the crime, a few weeks of analysis, and a name. When the name came back, it didn't land the way people had spent 3 decades imagining it would. The Cox family had carried 31 years of unanswered questions. In the absence of answers, people fill the space with what feels plausible: a stranger, someone from outside the neighborhood, a member of the 9th Street Dog Gang, someone whose face they didn't recognize, whose name they didn't know, whose existence could be separated from the life Fawn had lived. The DNA didn't give them that. The DNA gave them a family member, Donald Cox Jr., Fawn's cousin. He had been 21 years old in the summer of 1989 when Fawn was 16. Someone the Cox family called by name at holiday gatherings. Someone who had been to that house on East 9th Street without anyone questioning why. Someone who didn't need to scope out a stranger's home because he already knew it. He knew the layout. He knew which bedroom was on the second floor. He knew which window could be reached from outside. And on that humid July night, he knew that the air conditioner running downstairs would drown out any sound that came from above. Donald Cox Jr. was not alive to face what the DNA had proven. He had died of a drug overdose years before the 2020 investigation identified him. There would be no trial, no courtroom moment where the Cox family could sit across from him and hear the weight of what he had done read aloud in front of witnesses. That moment had been taken from them. Between November 9th and 11th, 2020, the Kansas City Police Department sat down with the Cox family and told them what 31 years of work had produced. They delivered the name. The KCPD did not publicly release it. American legal principles generally protect individuals who were never formally charged from having their identity disclosed by law enforcement. It was the Cox family themselves who chose to speak to the press. It was their name to release. It was their story to tell. Felicia Cox, the same sister who had climbed the stairs that July morning in 1989 and gone in to wake Fawn up, offered the words that said everything that needed to be said. The answer isn't always what we were asking for. The Fawn Cox case became a landmark in Kansas City Police Department history. It was the first murder in the department's history to be solved through advanced genetic genealogy, and beyond the headlines, beyond the historic first, the case left behind 3 lessons that carry real weight for anyone who has been touched by an unsolved violent crime. The first lesson lives in a decision made in 1989 by investigators and CSI technicians who had no idea what the future held. They collected biological evidence from Fawn's body that night on East 9th Street, and they preserved it correctly. They didn't lose it. They didn't discard it when the case went cold. They kept it through the 1990s, through 2 decades of no matches in CODIS, through every dead end in storage. That decision made in 1989 was the single foundation upon which the 2020 identification was built. Without proper preservation, advanced genetic genealogy has nothing to work with. If you have a loved one who is a cold case victim, the most important question you can ask the investigating agency is simple: is the biological evidence still preserved, and has it been retested with current technology? The second lesson is about the barrier that Captain Caldwell openly acknowledged. He knew after the Golden State Killer case that advanced genetic genealogy could unlock the Fawn Cox investigation. But cost and access stood in the way. This isn't a rare problem. Across the United States, there are tens of thousands of cold cases that could potentially be solved with this technology if the investigating agencies had the budget and the expertise to apply it. Many smaller police departments don't. For families of cold case victims whose cases sit with under-resourced agencies, there are nonprofit organizations dedicated specifically to connecting families with genetic genealogy resources that law enforcement can't afford to pursue on their own. Those organizations exist. They have solved cases. Finding them can be the step that changes everything. The third lesson is the hardest one to sit with because it challenges the basic assumption that guides most criminal investigations. From the very beginning of the Fawn Cox case, the crime scene told investigators something specific. The killer knew this house. He knew which window led to her room. He chose it deliberately. That evidence pointed not toward a random criminal, not toward a gang member stumbling through an unfamiliar neighborhood, but toward someone with intimate knowledge of the Cox family home. For 31 years, traditional investigative tools couldn't bridge the distance between that evidence and a name. Not because detectives didn't work hard enough, not because they missed something obvious, but because the person responsible for Fawn's death had a legitimate reason to know everything he knew. He was family. There was no suspicious behavior to flag, no unexplained knowledge to investigate, no anomaly in his presence to trigger a second look. He belonged to the world the Cox family inhabited. Genetic genealogy was the only tool that could cut through that particular kind of invisibility. It doesn't ask who had motive. It doesn't ask who acted suspicious. It asks what the DNA says, and it follows the answer wherever it leads, through family trees, through generations, through the branches of ancestry that connect people in ways they never think about until science makes those connections visible. Fawn Marie Cox set her alarm clock before she went to bed on the night of July 26, 1989. She was 16 years old. She had a job. She had a next day she was planning for. The alarm went off the next morning. She wasn't there to turn it off. For 31 years, her family carried that silence. They carried the unanswered question of who had climbed through that window. They carried the version of the story they told themselves when the truth wasn't available, and then they were given an answer. The answer hurt in a way that no one had prepared for. It didn't close the wound cleanly. It replaced one kind of grief with another. The loss of Fawn compounded by the loss of who they thought Donald Cox Jr. had been. But there is something in this story that cannot be overlooked, something that deserves to be named directly. The detectives who kept this case alive across multiple decades, who never let it be forgotten, who kept meeting with a grieving family year after year with no resolution to offer but the promise that the investigation was still open. They made this ending possible. The evidence preserved in 1989 made this ending possible, and a technology that didn't exist when Fawn was alive made this ending possible. The Fawn Cox case was the first murder solved by the Kansas City Police Department using advanced genetic genealogy. It will not be the last. Across this country, in evidence rooms in small towns and major cities alike, biological samples from unsolved homicides are sitting in storage. Some of those samples are connected to killers who are still alive. And for every one of those cases, the technology that identified Donald Cox Jr. is either already available or becoming more accessible every year. The question isn't whether science can find the answer. The question is whether the will, the resources, and the decision to preserve the evidence correctly in the first place were all present when they needed to be. In Fawn Cox's case, they were. If you've made it to the end of this story, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And if you want to see more cases like this one, the cold cases, the investigations that took decades, the moments when science finally caught up with the truth, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.